The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever. We look at stories from business leaders who've dealt with anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges, how they fell down, how they pick themselves up, and how they hope work will change in the future. Today's guest is the co-founder of a Canada-based nonprofit that supports young environmental leaders to do their best and accelerate their careers. It's called the Starfish Canada.
We call it the Starfish Canada because it's after a story that has been adapted over the years. It's a story about starfish washing up on a shore and a young boy coming by and wanting to help the starfish. So he throws them back into the ocean one by one, but there's thousands of them along the shore. And someone else comes along and says, you know, there are a lot of starfish here. How are you possibly going to be able to make a difference and make a dent in this? And the boy picks up another one and throws it back into the ocean and says, well, I made a difference to that one. And so the story is certainly about small actions and how they can make a collective difference.
He reached out to me because eco-anxiety is something he sees every day. If you're like me, you carry anxiety and grief for our planet with you. Sure, you can forget about it for days, even weeks at a time, but it's there. And if you're like Liz Porter, who I just shared a stage with last week in Los Angeles, you can't forget it because wildfires stole your house, your livelihood, and your memories. In 2021, the American Psychological Association found that 2/3 of American adults said they were somewhat or extremely anxious about the impact of climate change. And more than half said they were somewhat or extremely anxious about its impact on their mental health. You know, often anxiety is about trying to figure out a way to act on something. We talk about it at work all the time. Anxiety propels us. But with the climate crisis and with other huge global problems, it can feel like we can't really do anything as a single individual. Or maybe we have concerns we're not doing enough. Kyle Empringham is the founder of the Starfish Canada. We spoke about climate anxiety and what it means for kids and adults. And we started by talking about why he decided to start a nonprofit in the first place.
You certainly need an entrepreneurial spirit to want to do this. And so that's certainly where it sort of came from. The co-founder, Sujani Kandasamy, and myself, we started this out of recognizing when we were in university that we were having all these really big conversations about environmentalism and climate change. And then we would turn to friends who were maybe outside of our department or not learning in the exact same way. And we realized they had no understanding of that. And we wanted to sort of break the mold and talk to engineers and nursing departments and commerce folks all about this because we saw the work being completely intersectional. And so we started a blog is what we called it 12 years ago. And then from there, it just kept growing, just sort of step by step. There was always a good reason to want to keep moving forward and scaling up our work. And because of that, I think the impacts that we've had over the country have just grown and grown.
That's great. How did your own anxiety play into both, if it did, starting the organization and then in growing it and driving it forward?
Yeah, I think a big part of where I think the anxiety comes in is recognizing and having these conversations in classrooms about environmentalism and climate change. And this was starting in 2010 when Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their reports were not even as alarming as they are now. Actually, I think if you read them side by side, you'll probably see that they start banging the table louder and louder. So you can imagine that they were not as loud in 2010, although they certainly were enough to want to do something. And what we saw was where you're having all these conversations about how there's a lot to do, but there just wasn't enough being done. At the time, I remember in class, we were learning about renewable energies and how actually if you put a solar panel on everywhere you could in the world and actually used tidal power and wind power, any sort of renewable energy and coated the earth with it, we still wouldn't have enough. That's how efficient and technically ineffective that was at the time. And so to hear that and then be like, oh, by the way, also, if we don't fix it, there's going to be an issue a long time down the road, and we need to actually start now. But we also don't have the technology to do it. And that's enough to sort of kick me in the pants a little bit to want to try to figure out pieces of that puzzle. And so a part of what we wanted to do as a part of that is we knew that there was so much potential in harnessing the power of conversation through young minds and ideas and be able to bring those forward. For us, it was an intrinsic call to action for ourselves to want to be able to talk to people all across different spaces and places, to be able to find answers that didn't exist at the time.
I want to talk in a little bit more sort of broadly about climate anxiety and how we carry that with us. But first, I'd love to hear your own story. You reached out to me and you said that you have your own sort of anxiety journey and mental health journey. And I'd love to hear your story.
I think there's a lot here. And one of the things that I certainly want to start off in my story, and probably it'll trickle through other pieces of this puzzle, is that, when we're talking about climate justice and climate work, I think it's really important to say how intersectional all those things are. That climate justice is social justice, it's gender justice, it's health justice, all those things are embedded. So I think very strongly that we won't be able to solve a climate crisis without thinking about the impact that climate has on mental health and how we make sure that we work on those things together and all at once.
I just have to say, you're the first person I've ever heard who said that.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I think not that climate change is an intersectional issue and not that it doesn't touch all aspects of everything else we fight for, but that it's related to our mental health. But of course, that makes sense.
I think that, it certainly is that. And, part of what we do now is about engaging young hearts and minds on environmentalism. And when we talk to them over and over again, what we hear is, yeah, we want to do something, but like, oh my gosh, is this such a big issue? Like, how do I, as one person, even start to tackle that? And so there's people who feel like they're trying to do work and trying to do good work, and then they feel like they burn out really quickly because they can't see the impacts of their own labor year over year, even sometimes. And so I get that. And then, of course, we've all been working on this for a while. And so imagine working in this field as a young person, trying to find your way in a career and trying to make sure that you have a planet that you want to live on in 20, 30 years. And then all the work that you do, the data says, actually, you haven't done enough.
You're not doing enough.
Yeah.
Actually, let's stay on that before we go to your story. That's a really interesting point. Like, how do you stay motivated and keep other people motivated when your work is so incremental? Like, I work a lot in social media. Like, I can literally see results. Did I do a good job in a minute or, a couple of days? How do you, as a leader, stay motivated and keep those around you motivated when A, you're not doing a good enough job, and B, you don't know what success looks like almost?
Yeah. I mean,
not that you're not doing a good job, but you know what I mean.
Totally. It's $1 million question, I think. It's one of those things that's really the goal of everyone is to like curb climate change. That's a really big, complex and wicked problem, and a really cool thing if we could solve it. But of course, what we know is that requires shifts in so many different ways of thinking. That certainly can't happen overnight. And so I think a part of that is, when working in this space, young people want to make impacts, and it's not that they don't, but it's hard to meet the end objective, and it's going to take a community. And I think that's where the part of that answer lives, is that it really does take not just a village, it takes many villages. It takes kind of different villages all over the planet and in different ways and shapes and diversities to be able to actually solve that. And so what we do is we convene community. That's one of the biggest things that we can do to create solutions in pockets that can grow to bigger spaces and places and can be quite resilient as well. And then layer in the elements of anxiety to that. When you build in a community of practitioners that are full of not just hope and optimism, but kindness and understanding and compassion for each other, then that to me creates resiliency in people, to be able to weather storms and to be able to understand that the success path here is certainly not going to be linear, and we might take a step back to take a few steps forward. But really, the journey also has to be as important as the destination, or we'll never find the destination in itself.
People get anxious when they're worried that they're not hitting milestones. They feel like there are boxes to check, but they can't check them, or they're not checking them. Data show that you have to be able to sort of stop and acknowledge your wins in order to really to keep the anxious thoughts at bay, right? To give yourself the motivation to keep pushing forward. Most people are really bad at it, and our organizations are not designed for it, but it's essential.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think especially in the environmental movement as a collective, I think we've learned and understood, I've seen it evolve over, about 12 or so years in this space where, at the start it was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much to do. We need to get going. We just need to hammer through it. If you're not making progress, you're falling behind, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And I think I've seen the frame shift to community, to resiliency, to we're working on this together. I think that's been so helpful. I know for me personally to feel like, I'm contributing to a collective. And I think for other people as well to know that there are people who are making incredible positive change, and to lift each other up and to work on this together is an essential part of the puzzle.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Let's go back to your story. Tell us your history and also why you have a passion for mission-driven work.
Yeah. My story starts in a suburban town in Ontario, about 30 minutes north of Toronto. And so, I grew up with a decent amount of privilege, and I always admit to that as a white male. In my story as well, I'm also a gay man, and a part of how life shaped up for me in a really traditional household was that I never felt safe in the space to be able to actually talk openly about my sexuality. And so grew up in a space where certainly I think I hadn't quite admitted it to myself, because there was this element that was always like layered onto me to not talk about it. Although, if I went, even not too far into my brain, I'd recognize that piece of myself. And even in that story as well, there were a lot of moments where, just because I think people identified myself as a gay man before I did myself, have a lot of unfortunate stories about being bullied and harassed. And even some of them come through, like even me, like when I was walking home from school, once I got garbage thrown at me, once someone actually fired a paintball gun at me and hit me. And so I, there were things that sort of like kind of, not only was I never really okay with like wanting to talk about it myself because of the situation I was in, but then there were these moments like this that just like really reinforced, like, maybe you're not welcome here. Maybe this is not the space for you. And so I think the other thing that balances that out and actually taught me to stand up for myself were those incredible people. And in my case, they were all incredible women who would tap me on the shoulder, saw that I was a smart, bright young man who was capable of doing many things, even when I often discounted myself for whatever reason. Like my music teacher who told me I should be in the school play because I had a great singing voice and could certainly do it. And then eventually got the lead role because of her convincing me to audition.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And so and then many people telling me that I could be a leader if I really wanted to do that and put myself out there. And so I did. And because of that, I started learning about those intersections all at once, saying like, you know what? Yes, there's a lot here that you're going to have to work through in order to get to a space where you can be open about yourself and accepting of yourself. But by doing that and actually showcasing that you can yourself in the truest form of yourself, you're giving permission for other people to be themselves and authentically unique as well. And so from that ethic has built this like value of myself that I can only do purpose-driven work, that the things that I do have to sort of bring in people to work for a collective. I don't really, there's been other offers and things that people have asked me to do. And I find it hard and difficult actually to do something that feels intrinsically even like for profit, I suppose is even the way to put it. Like, I feel like a part of me is really about making sure that people on the planet are well taken care of.
It's almost like you felt like an outsider growing up and you didn't belong. And so you've made your work all about building community and fighting hard stuff.
Absolutely. And of course, I think the funniest part, not funniest, I think an interesting part about that is that it's so embedded into my ethic to the point where, I'm incredibly hardworking, and actually a part of another element of my anxiety journey shows up through that I certainly want to do everything all at once. And the nature of it is, even when I was in fourth year university, I was doing an undergraduate thesis project, volunteering 6 different places, taking 6 courses at the same time. An insane amount of work, or a very large amount of work, I should say. It was just something that wasn't sustainable. And I remember once in a meeting about my thesis and my research project and getting 6 things assigned to me or something like that. And in that room, I felt like I suddenly couldn't breathe. And then I went to the bathroom, actually, and I was like, what is happening? Oh my gosh, I don't know. I'm feeling lightheaded, I'm sweating, I don't know. And then I walked back into the room and said, I'm going home. I don't feel very well. And walked home. And it wasn't until I started telling myself, you actually maybe don't have to do everything that you think you have to do, that my body was able to calm down. I thankfully lived with someone who was in pre-medical studies at the time. And I told her about this. And then she was like, oh, well, that's a panic attack. I was like, oh, okay, great. Now I know. And of course, as a young, naive person, I was like, okay, well, that was just one time. So then I just, went back to school and kept going, but learned soon after to how to manage and do that and make sure that, I don't wear myself out for the sake of just wanting to do the most good in the world. And that, it takes resiliency to be able to do that and to manage my anxiety so that I can make that impact.
What do you do to manage your anxiety?
Ooh, lots of things. I think a part of it is always making sure that I can firstly manage my energy levels a little bit better. And so on a daily course of things, I always have lots of meetings booked, but sometimes I'll do the walk and talk meeting if it makes sense to do so, or find different ways to navigate through conversations. So even about making sure if I need a camera off meeting, even asking for that so that I can just sit on the couch and talk. And sometimes for me, that helps manage myself as a human in the moment. I do quite a bit of meditation as well. And so being able to do that, even 5-minute meditations that I can guide myself through, those have been really helpful to just, when I realize that maybe there's a moment that's coming up where I'm feeling like there's a lot to do, to just be able to center myself in my body. And then I do talk to a counselor as well. And I think that's just the nature of that is there can be a lot of stigma around asking for help in this space generally. And especially in men, a lot of men don't feel like they should talk to counselors for different reasons, as if it's a non-masculine thing to do so. But for me, I think it's one of those things that when someone suggested it to me, I said, well, I don't feel like it's fair to knock it unless I've tried it. And tried it different ways in different spaces. And so actually took me a few times to find a counselor that was right for me. And now that I have found someone, it's fantastic. It's a great way to just have a conversation, be open and honest. And it doesn't, I think maybe the movies hype it up more than what it is. I'm not back on leaning on a chair, and I'm not asking, how does that make me feel? It's having a genuine and authentic conversation that actually helps me gain clarity in my headspace. And that's invaluable for the work that I'm doing.
Totally. How do you define climate anxiety? How should people think of it if they've never thought about it in that context?
I think a lot of people look at climate anxiety in different spaces. For me, though, I think of it as the fact that we know that greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to a warming planet, that it is a complex and wicked problem. Complex meaning that there's lots of different pieces to it, and wicked meaning it's so societally embedded in how we operate and do things that it requires a large shift in order to solve that issue. That's the climate piece. And the anxiety piece is how, the nature of this work in solving such a complex and wicked problem is so inherently difficult to solve. And so the nature of trying to solve it is going to require a lot of time and energy and effort, billions among trillions of dollars, to be able to actually, get us into the right space. And that the fact that starts at an individual level in some senses. And I'm not necessarily referring to changing your light bulbs, although it's nice to be energy efficient with those light bulbs when you can. It's about the fact that, that weight can feel like it is on an individual's shoulders. I don't think it ever is, but it can often feel that way. And I think that's where climate anxiety comes in. It's this inherent weight that I need to do something and I need to do my part. Yet there's this complex and wicked problem. And the chances are, no matter how much I do, maybe it's not going to be enough.
Yeah. It's funny. I have had personal experience with two friends, both of whom worked in, for-profit careers, pretty great long for-profit careers, who reached a point of mourning where they felt like they were mourning the oncoming death of something. That's how they put it to me. And it was the world. And one of them left corporate law to work in mission-driven climate work, and the other one got very depressed. And I was thinking about that in the context of mourning. I almost feel like when I see an article of a UN report or IPCC, I have an hour of feeling that grief, and then I just try to go about my day. But of course, the sort of grief and anxiety is with you if you read about this stuff and take it seriously.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's certainly what I think a lot of young folks, including myself, are feeling. And, there's this work is going to involve moments, certainly, where not great stuff is going to be known or happen or be reported on. I think that's the nature of this work in some senses. What we want is, and what I think sometimes contributes to the anxiety in this space is that we want a linear path to solving the issue. The chances are we won't probably have that, especially because, again, it is so complicated to be able to address this. And so the nature of it is that I do think it is, sometimes we'll take steps back, but we'll still be able to make some steps forward. And that's the framing that helps me as an anxious person sort of be able to sit with the elements of climate anxiety that I have and to be able to move forward.
Do you have to identify the steps? I mean, I guess the steps are probably easier for you because you work in this space. But I'm thinking for those of us who don't work in this space, but feel that we also have that anxiety and need something clear to focus on. Like,
when I think about the steps here, I think one of the things that a coach gave me a long time ago is this space of naming it to tame it, which I think I'm hearing in some of the things that you've said about some of the friends that you've been conversing with. Being able to understand what you're going through and how you're feeling is an essential part of how to be able to move forward. I think, and maybe that's a little cliche in some senses. I think, in some sort of spaces that's probably quite clear. But I think, being able to talk about climate anxiety and even understanding that is what it is a way of moving forward. The parallel here is that, like, I grew up technically knowing I was gay, but never actually admitting it to myself until I was about 18. And only then was I actually able to start making progress about how I show up in the world, how I come out to friends and family, and who I tell, and sort of my philosophy around that actually only started evolving really when I was able to figure out and name exactly what it was that was going on in my brain. And so I think that there are parallels there. Sometimes we hear it and we don't quite address it, or we don't talk about it enough. And if we don't talk about it enough and kind of do the proverbial sweeping it under the rug, or kind of like burying it in our bodies as we try to navigate through the day, that can make it really difficult to see how to make progress. And often I think it can sometimes even work in the opposite direction. You're kind of like swallowing that up within yourself. And then, it's like, oh, well, then now I can't make a difference. Or now, it sort of starts feeding into a cycle.
Yeah.
That's why I think naming it's so important.
I agree. Because otherwise, I think, the way that I see it, again, not as a practitioner who works in climate change every day, is that I carry the ambient anxiety. And it doesn't even have to be about climate change, frankly, at this point in our world. It could be about the pandemic. It could be about the war. You sort of have this intersection of like, oh my God, the world is so scary. I'm terrified. I'm anxious. I don't know what to do. But then you zoom into your day, you have to show up at work and have a meeting, or you have to go pick up your kids. But the ambient anxiety, the existential anxiety is still there. It's not gone away. It's just not maybe triggered at that moment.
Yeah. I recognize that in myself. I'm able to be able to sort of like, I do a lot of self-reflection, and through sometimes the art of meditation, through counseling and through things. And so because of that, I'm able to center like my thoughts and feelings in different spaces and use techniques that can help me sort of just navigate through conversations and whatnot. And I think another thing that I would mention there that some people do as a way of anchoring their climate anxiety is that they ground it in practicality. So what are the small things I can do, and know that each small thing I do is like tossing that starfish back into the ocean. Like it genuinely does make a difference. And so for me, sometimes it's, for the nature of the organization I run, like what is the programming that we're running this week or next month? Or what are the conversations I can have in order to help even one or two people this week navigate through a difficult scenario that's climate related? And being able to do that, I think, is really some of the essentials to be able to take what you feel and to be able to like harness it for a force of good.
Mm-hmm. So what, can I just ask you, like, what are some things if people are listening to this and thinking, oh my God, I have climate anxiety. How can they channel that?
Yeah, I do certainly think the conversations that you have are paramount to understanding the things in your life that you'll be able to do. And that's why I certainly love being able to chat with friends, family, counselors, those sorts of people that are able to sort of ask great questions about how I'm thinking and feeling. Mm-hmm. I think in a climate space, and especially because, again, it is such a broad and almost all-encompassing lens on the world, everyone's situation is a little bit different.
Yeah,
maybe the privilege that you have or the accessibility of things can certainly dictate the things that you might be able to do. And so for me, as someone who's run an organization and a charity, and we have a network of young folks, I'm able to impart wisdom, guidance, and advice and learn from young people at the same time. And those mutually beneficial conversations really, fuel me from a place of wanting to do really great work. And another thing that I think is really interesting there is, that those conversations sometimes can just be little sparks that ignite a fire. That's what our co-founder Sujani says all the time, that we're trying to ignite fires within the young hearts and minds. And I think that that's so incredibly important. And that's always done through the nature of being able to understand where you're at in life and what pieces of the puzzle that you have a stake over or involvement in, to be able to make a quick change that can mean a lot to other people.
What are some things that the young people you work with have taught you about resiliency in the face of a big problem?
Gosh, I'm always incredibly inspired by the young folks that I get to interact with. At the Starfish Canada, we have a top 25 environmentalists under 25 award. And so every year we award 25 people an award for incredible change making and try to help accelerate their environmental careers as well. And what we hear and what I've seen is when we get those nominations in, it is the most inspiring time of the year for me and for many others. And through that, we get to then connect and collaborate with them. What I hear from them is, there's this passion to be able to make a difference, not for themselves or for other people. And what they've taught me through that is that, yes, there is so much going on in the world, and there's so much that can certainly weigh you down. And sort of people and systems can sort of project things onto yourself. And the ability to be able to take that energy and to be able to channel it into things that, are meaningful to you and meaningful to the people around you, it can be paramount to being able to even not only just doing good in the world, but doing good to yourself in the process. It's taught me to lead with a lot of heart and a lot of courage, and to be able to stand up for things when I don't really quite think that's the most just way to go about it. And it's led me to a lot of courageous conversations, and ones where, as an anxious person, I admit sometimes it's even to the point where I'm physically shaking. And yet I know that when I'm thinking about how to do that for the collective of people that are around me and those things, I'm willing to take the shakes for a minute in order to hopefully maybe change a frame of mind, and that can create a more resilient community in the environmental space.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great tactic actually for reducing anxiety, is to step outside yourself, right? It's very Buddhist, and connect with the larger us, the larger being, and think about, this isn't for me. I need to get outside my own head and my own ego. So that leads me to my last question, which is, I think we saw during the pandemic that employers were acknowledging that they had a role in helping their employees feel more secure. Good employers, a lot didn't, but I think a lot of employers were sort of like, we're in this together. People are really anxious. We gotta talk about it at least. Are you seeing, do you think we're going to be in that same situation at some point with climate change writ large? Is this going to be something that employers have a role in creating a conversation at least and driving towards solutions with their employees?
I'll be honest, I think a part of it is already happening in the spaces and businesses that understand how those intersections exist. My hope is certainly that it gets to be a lot bigger. I think that there's two ways I would look at it. So from a business perspective, I would say that there is clearly an imperative for businesses to start doing the right things. And that, we can't be operating as a free market when we have so many externalities that businesses are literally polluting the world and not paying for it. Mm-hmm. And I think businesses know that if they are able to actually figure out a way to capture that externality and to be able to bring that into the true cost of how they operate, that there are methods and techniques that they can use in order to do better as a business. Mm-hmm. But then there's the other layer that I think it's clear that there's a consciousness within a lot of folks that acting on climate change is the right thing to do. So from another business perspective is if you want to have happy and productive and safe employees, that, you need to be able to do the things within the business and maybe even to a degree a little bit outside of the business that help your employees understand that this is the place that they want to work. Because if businesses aren't taking that lens into account about what employees are expecting of their company to do from a climate perspective, well, there are a lot of other places that they could go work that are doing a lot better probably. And so I think it's one of those things where the market itself in a lot of industries are now trying to collectively raise the bar out of almost like competing with each other. Because right now we do know there's that term, the Great Resignation, and people shifting jobs around all over the place, which is to me an example of the pandemic has shown, mental health is important, and I need to make sure I work at a place that really honors me as a human being and the mental health needs that I have, and some of that will be climate related.
Kyle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That's it for today's show. The Anxious Achiever is produced and edited by Mary Dew. Our assistant producer and sound engineer is Nick Krinko. Many thanks to all our guests for sharing their stories with us. And thank you to our advertisers for supporting. If you want to share your story about mental health and work, send me a message on LinkedIn. I'll always respond. If you love the show, tell your friends, subscribe or follow us and leave a review. From LinkedIn Presents, this is Maura Aarons-Mele.